Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
You're alive.
You know, but the quality, move the light back a little bit. It's too strong. Yeah, that's good. That's better. Keep it on. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. As we're waiting for more participants, I'm going to tell a story, Bismillah, that happened just yesterday. I was doing my Saturday rounding and I went to a store. I'm going to not give all the details so that this person, in case he's embarrassed, will not be identifiable. Anyway, I'm outside of a store and I meet a man from the Middle East. And he comes actually running up to me and said, "Are you a Sufi?" And I said, "Yes, why?" He said, "I'm also a Sufi. I'm an Uwaisi Sufi." I said, "Oh, that's very interesting. I've never met one, although I did know the story of Uwais." And I said, "How did you come to be an Uwaisi Sufi?" And he tells me the following story. In his childhood, he was in a very difficult kind of family. His parents never got along and they were fighting all the time. And eventually, his mom decided to divorce the dad and left him with his father. Now, his mom was a hard lady, not very loving, and so he was relatively happy to be with his dad, who was at least a neutral force. But then what occurred, as often happens in these situations, his dad got remarried, and the stepmother was not very happy about having these children around. So the dad decided to dispatch them to various places. And amongst others, he sent this son to the mother's place, which he was not too happy about. So they're driving in the car, and the man his father is berating him, about his bad behavior or whatever. And he's only about 7 or 8, and he decides to respond back to the dad and said, "Look, I didn't choose that lady as my mother. You chose her. So you're responsible for all the difficulties, so you should be trying to help me out, because this wasn't my fault." Anyways, dad obviously didn't like his response, and he threw him out of the car. Now, he knew where his mother was. It was a few kilometers away. But now he didn't have his dad, and he wasn't looking forward to his mom, and he was very desperate. So he decided it was time to suicide. So he went there were a few bridges near where he was. The first bridge wasn't high enough. He came to the second bridge, and he started climbing up the ladder so he could jump off. And as he was climbing up the ladder, a voice came to him and said, "Who inspired you to do this? Who pushed you to do this?" So he's a reflective kind of guy, intelligent guy, and he started thinking. He said, "Well, it's my thoughts that are telling me this." And the voice says to him, "Haven't you realized already that your thoughts are unreliable?" So he thought about it. He said, "Yeah, he's right." So he said, "It must be my emotions." And the voice said, "But that's even worse." He thought about it again. He said, "Yeah, you're right." And at that point, he dropped all belief in his thoughts and in emotions, and then suddenly he was in this hal. He was feeling really elated, and the voice came back to him and said, "Okay, now you can get on with your life." And he climbed down the ladder and went to his mom's place. While all this had been going on, the voice had said to him, "You're not," and he named his name Ahmed, "you're not Ahmed, you're Uwais." And so he tracked down the meaning of this term, Uwais, and eventually became an Uwaisi Sufi. Okay, so just a little intro story. today that I thought was interesting from another tariqat, which that's a whole other story, which believes that you don't actually need a spiritual master. You can do it through an interconnection. But we're not going into that story today. Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The title today of today's talk is Expanding the Database. That sounds pretty bureaucratic and pretty scientific, but actually it's really profound. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I found that people arrive at a lot of false conclusions, usually because their sources are too narrow. And this affects a lot of situations. I saw this first, or one of the times, I've seen it often in medical situations, where I was struck by the fact, let's say with some diseases like chronic fatigue syndrome, that the judges understand better than the doctors what's going on. And I asked myself, why is that? How come the judge with no medical training understands what's going on and the doctor doesn't get it? And the answer came to, it's very simple. The doctor relies on peer-reviewed scientific articles and the conferences which resume them, period. The judge, on the other hand, brings in witnesses, listens to people's experience, and is able to integrate that into his analysis and his conclusions. And because he's expanded the database, because he's expanded the source of, he comes to the right conclusion and the doctors don't. Okay? Now, so I've come to think that if you want to make good decisions in life, you should adopt the judge's position. And this is also the position of the Sunnah, which says always do consultation, istikhara and istishara. Okay, consult with your Lord and consult with people around you and expand your database that way so you can come to right decisions. Now, Islamically, this is also extremely important. And one of the reasons that the ulama get it wrong sometimes, I won't say often, but it may even be often, is because their only database is the Quran and the Hadith. Now, that's a very solid base, but we have to expand it. There's so many other areas of knowledge that we need to integrate into our analysis if we want to get things right. Now, it doesn't mean that there's any errors, stuff for Allah, in either the Quran, and mostly there aren't serious errors in the Hadith either, but in order to understand them properly, in order not to misinterpret, we need to gather all the data, all the sources of information. We talked about this last week in terms of the question of comparative religion, and I've seen numerous examples over the years of Christian people who are obviously in a good place on the other side. This flies in the face of the ulama's analysis that any Christian or Jew after the time of Muhammad who doesn't believe in Muhammad, peace be upon him, is condemned to the hellfires. Just doesn't add up with a lot of the other data, including the NDE experiences that we'll be talking about today. So, what areas of knowledge? History, science, psychology, sociology, comparative, all of these things should be integrated into your analysis. All of these things can provide you insights that you can use to come to the right conclusion. So, one of the areas that I've been particularly interested in and written a book on is the area of NDEs, near-death experiences. And it so happens that this weekend is the annual conference of near-death experience, IANS Association, the International Association of Near-Death Studies, okay, who also attempts to be very rigorous in their research, although that's a whole other item. Okay, and so I enrolled in the live streaming because I didn't have the time or the energy to go to Colorado, where it's being held, to see what I could pick up from their annual conference. And every time I listened to these people, I learned something about my own tradition. So I'm going to give you a little bit of some of the jewels, if you want, that I found, some of the bits of wisdom that I was able to garner from this year's IANS meeting. One of the first presenters was a lady named Tricia. You'll see how all of this interacts with the idea of the database. And Tricia was a Christian lady from an evangelical background who had a terrible accident and a near-death experience and had a vision of the one God, luminous, loving, all-knowing. When she came back and reported this to her parents, maybe unwisely, they immediately took her to their evangelical priest, who said, "This is from the devil. This is from Satan." Why? Because you didn't see Jesus Christ. You saw the one God. Yeah. Yes. No. A lot of people from the South who have had near-death experiences from the Bible Belt in the United States have been denounced by their church as being demonic, because it didn't correspond to the Bible's account of Jesus and the Christian catechism. So we see it's not only Muslims who need to challenge their beliefs at times, but also Christians and Jews and Buddhists. We'll get to Buddhists at the end, because this, for me, was the one of the key discoveries or confirmations, if you want. Another lady was named Lisa, and her question was, when she got to God on the other side, another near-death experience, she started asking him about the Bible. And God answered her. She said, "What? The Bible has led to so much conflict, so many wars, so much murder. You know, what's the problem?" And she was answered that the Bible was written for a different time, for a different mentality. Now, there are a lot of other things to say about this, and the texts of the Bible, and whether, as Muslims claim, the Bible and the Torah were rewritten and edited, and it's certainly not the authentic text that the Quran is. But the idea that the Bible was written for a different time is also relevant to us, because the Quran also belongs to a different time. That doesn't mean there aren't things in there that are eternal and still very applicable. Many things are constant, but there are some aspects that are sociological, and there are some aspects that are contextual, and we have to understand that. For example, I always think of the example of the way paradise is described. You know, it's described in a way that is the antithesis of the desert. So if instead of directing yourself to an Arab, you were directing yourself to someone in the British Isles, and you said there's lots of water and gardens there, they'd say, "Give me a break. I want sun and sand. That's where I go for my paradise." So we could see a certain kind of relativistic aspect also to the Quranic revelation, which is directed to an Arab people who are always in desert, people who are lacking in water and lacking in greenery, and they're looking forward to seeing that. That doesn't mean there aren't gardens and rivers on the other side at all. It's just what kind of reaction one might have to that. You know, an British person might say, "So what? It's the same as England." No, it ain't the same as England. Sorry. Okay. Now, one of the people came back. This is interesting. This one may be directed to vegans. No names mentioned. But one of the ladies was told that both animals and plants have souls as well, even plants. This shouldn't be surprising. A local researcher who was a Subud member did research on plants and found out, for example, that if you took water that was held by depressed people and watered the plants with that water, the plants grew more slowly and some of them died, as opposed to watering plants with people who are in good health. Also, there was also recordings made of plants as you were cutting them, doing the equivalent of shouting or screaming. So plants also have souls. Sorry about that for the vegan people who think that they're being uncruel by only eating plants. That can be discussed. Okay. Another lady named Nancy came back with a couple of ideas, one of which is keep your belief systems malleable. This is very interesting. Don't get stuck in fixed positions, generally. Okay, we all have our convictions, but be careful about being too strict, too narrow with your convictions. And the other thing that this lady was reminded of was that God was telling her to remind people to go to nature. This is something I've discovered myself over the years, that people who spend more time in nature, it helps them. Why? Because nature is directly God's creation. You know, whereas what we're surrounded by in cities, I know someone who loves New York City, you know. In New York City, you're surrounded by people and buildings and concrete and noise. This is the creations of man. But the creations of God are much more sublime, are much more spiritual in a way, are uplifting. So whenever you get a chance, go into nature. Some people have integrated that into their weekly practice, and once a week they go for a walk in the woods or the forest. I was just hearing a talk by a sheikh from the Naqshbandis talking about how he loved to spend time in the forest. So in the forest, you're in God's creation rather than man's creation. Now, for me, this year, the highlight of the conference, and maybe some of you have heard about this, was a story presented, an accounting presented by a lady named Nancy Bush Evans. Or Nancy Evans Bush, excuse me. Most people probably haven't heard of her. She was one of the earliest people to report distressing or hellish near-death experiences. Most of the community is not comfortable with that, and Raymond Moody's initial book claimed even that he hadn't found any, but actually when you begin looking, you'll find quite a few. Anyway, this lady has written, published some of her own experience, other people's experiences, is kind of like the specialist in IANS, in hellish, distressing near-death experiences. And the one she reports is of a Buddhist monk. Now this report has stirred up a tremendous amount of controversy, and from the modern point of view is politically incorrect to the extreme. But listen to it anyway. So this was a story of a Buddhist monk in Burma, one of the big centers of Vipassana Buddhism, who died from an epidemic of, he had cholera and yellow fever. And supposedly his body was even in the midst of putrefaction when he came back to life. And on the other side, he saw Buddhist monks in a lake of fire. And he asked, why are these monks in a lake of fire? And he was told, because they don't believe in Jesus. Then it went even further, and he saw the Buddha himself in the fire. And he asked, why is he in the fire? And he was told, because he doesn't believe in the eternal God. Now, Of course, this was sent shockwaves through the Buddhist community. It was so politically incorrect that even the Christian community of Burma refused this and said that this is a fraud. This is an invention by some evangelical Christians who, of course, were ecstatic about all of this. But the person responsible stood by his story. I think this is like a 15, 20-year-old story, and he stayed by his story. Now this is that. Now, the Dalai Lama, for example, says this directly. He said, "We don't believe in a creator God." Most people think there's nothing to that. It's not serious. But for those of us, for example, in the Islamic faith, believing in a creator God is the basis of everything. It's the basis of being a believer. It's the basis of what we call taqwa, God consciousness. This is very important. It can't just be shoved aside. The modern mind might see this very differently. Now, the reason I think this is really important, if not politically correct, is because and I'm not the only one, but I came to the same conclusion myself many, many years ago. And probably people don't know the story, but I was on a long retreat, and I was in the midst of losing my mind, and I prayed to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and there was absolutely no response. And I remembered an old Sufi, Saul Baradovsky, saying, when you're in difficulty, say Allahu Akbar. And I said Allahu Akbar 3 times, and my mind came back. But that was, and after that long retreat, I decided that I myself needed a religion, a spiritual path that had a creator God, that had God, that could, the helping God in the mix, had to be there. Okay? Now, of course, the Buddhists are not happy about this, but this is, as far as I'm concerned, that could be a fraud. I don't think so. This becomes part of my database. And it's really important in an epoch when Buddhism has such credibility. For those who are curious, there's a long chapter in my next book called Unpacking Buddhism, because I feel like Buddhism has been given a free ride in the modern world, and no one is willing to criticize it. Of course, the Dalai Lama was a victim of those terrible Chinese, admittedly, and the Buddhists haven't been too destructive, except recently. Anyone who believes that the Buddhists are just people of peace and calm can look at a couple of situations. In Sri Lanka, they were the major perpetrators of the violence there, not the Tamils, who were reacting to that violence. And now in Burma, as they're slaughtering and persecuting Muslims. So I always knew that no religion is exempt from violent, fanatical factions, but the Buddhists had been undercover for a long time in terms of their own violent inclinations. So, I hope I've furnished you with some things to think about and to consider. For me, this all becomes part of a kind of edifice of beliefs, not held too narrowly, but about what is really going on in this world and the next, and about the importance, you see, theologically, metaphysically, the problem is that Buddhism is focused almost uniquely on enlightenment. So it's focused on the, if you want, the unity aspect of the spiritual path. But there is not enough consideration, or not a balanced consideration, of the dualistic aspect. This we'll explain another time. The dualistic aspect meaning the relationship between us as relative beings and Allah, God, absolute consciousness as absolute being, and that dualistic relationship which the Advaita Vedanta that's so popular these days sets aside is very critical, if not actually primary, over the absolute, because the absolute remains, as Ramana Maharshi has said, the absolute remains whether we're aware of it or not. But the real struggle is getting our relative relationship between us as creations and the Creator on the right track. May Allah help us in all this. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Amin. Amin. Okay, now